Something most people don't know is you can't just put scuba tanks on and then dive down to any depth and come right back up again. The compressed air inside of those scuba tanks would be a mixture of oxygen as well as most likely helium and nitrogen. And when you're breathing that compressed air, the oxygen would get breathed up and then not linger inside of your body. But the other inert gases, the helium and the nitrogen, they would be breathed up and then absorbed into your bloodstream, and they would stay there until you resurfaced. Now, it's completely harmless as long as you understand how it works getting those gases out of your body. In a nutshell, as you ascend, these inert gases will leave your body on their own, but it's a gradual process. If you rocket to the surface before this takes place, these inert gases will not leave your body and they'll expand inside of you, and your body will become the equivalent of a shaken up soda can. And so at best, having all these bubbles inside of you is very painful. At worst, it's lethal. The term for this condition is decompression sickness, but it's better known as the bends. The way divers protect themselves from getting the bends is on their ascent, they do what's called a decompression stop. This is something that is planned into the dive where they stop at a certain depth for a certain amount of time, and that guarantees the inert gases have diffused out of their body before they reach the surface. Now, the deeper you go, the more decompression stops you'll have to do, and the longer they will take. For example, ascending from 2,000 feet would take over 33 hours to do safely. But luckily, none of us are trying to dive down to 2,000 feet. Well, unless you're trying to be an oil and gas saturation diver. Saturation divers, or SAT divers, do construction and demolition at depths of up to 2,000 feet below the surface. But they don't spend 33 hours ascending after every single dive. Instead, after their dives, they're artificially kept at their working depth. The way this works is the SAT diver climbs inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship or on board an oil rig, and this chamber also doubles as their living quarters. There's beds and there's a bathroom, but it's laughably small and uncomfortable. It looks like a small submarine. And once they go inside, they seal the door and then they pressurize it to match the depth that they're going to be working at the bottom of the ocean. And then also there's another pressure chamber called the dive bell that's connected directly onto the side of the chamber. And that's also pressurized to match the working depth. When it was time for the SAT diver to go to work, they would put their dive gear on inside of the chamber. They would crawl directly into the dive bell. They would shut the door behind them and seal it. And then people outside of the dive bell would physically disconnect it from the chamber. And then using a crane, they would place it in the water and then lower it down to their working depth. And once they get down there, because the pressure inside the bell is equal to the pressure outside the bell, they can just slide open a door on the bottom and the water does not come inside. And so the divers do slip through this hole and they do the work they need to do. And when they're done, they come back inside the dive bell, they shut it up, and then using the radio, they communicate with the people up on the boat or up on the rig, and they raise the bell back up, they reattach them to the chamber, they go inside, they take their stuff off, there's bunk beds and there's a bathroom inside of the chamber, and that's where they hang out until their next dive. This process is repeated for days and days and days, keeping them saturated with these gases. And then at the end of their shift, which is usually about a month long, they will have one long decompression they do inside of the chamber. While this system is highly efficient, it does not change the fact that saturation diving is extremely dangerous and terrifying. The sun doesn't reach below 700 feet, so most of the time these divers are in complete and total darkness, and it's unbelievably cold down there. And so their suits have hot water pumped into them through a tether that's connected to the dive bell. But if that were to fail, hypothermia would kick in almost immediately. They have flashlights, but the water is so full of sediment around the areas that they work that shining the light is basically like shining it into fog. You can't really see very far besides right in front of your face. SAT divers also report that sometimes the water around them will suddenly move violently, and they'll look around, but their crummy light and lack of visibility means they can't see what it was, but they know it's a large animal that's checking them out. Other times, these fairly large fish will swim right up to them and come right under their light. It's almost like they're being affectionate with the diver. But they're not being affectionate. They're trying to hide behind the SAT diver from some large predator that's out there watching them. Experienced SAT divers have learned to just accept their harsh environment down there and don't easily get scared. But there is one thing that all SAT divers are afraid of, and that is a lost bell. When SAT divers are down at their working depth, the dive bell that's brought them down there is usually situated right next to them, just kind of floating in the water. And this dive bell is connected to the ship or the oil rig above by a cable. And if that cable were to snap, the dive bell would fall to the bottom and it would take with it the divers because they're always tethered to the dive bell. If the divers survived the crash to the ocean floor, they would then just be trapped and have to hope that someone comes down to get them at some point before they run out of air or they succumb to hypothermia. While a lost bell scenario is incredibly rare, it has happened before. On August 7th, 1979, Richard Walker was inside of a pressure chamber on board a ship in the North Sea. He was a saturation diver who for the past 10 days had been in saturation and honestly was just over it. He wanted to go home to his wife and his 15-month-old daughter. That evening, before his scheduled dive, he wrote in his journal, "Dear God, I just want to get out." Soon after writing this entry, he and his partner, Victor Giel, put on their dive gear and hopped into the dive bell. The bell was detached from the chamber and then brought over to the side of the ship, and right before they lowered it into the water, somebody noticed the location transponder that basically beamed up where it was down below had become loose, and so the decision was made to just remove it. And so after they pulled it off, they lowered the dive bell onto the water and then slowly lowered it down to their working depth, which was 485 feet. Once they got down there, they opened up the hole at the bottom of the bell, and then they began taking turns exiting the bell to go work on this underwater structure. A few hours later, at 2:45 in the morning, Richard was the one outside of the dive bell, and he heard something behind him, and he turned around and he saw the dive bell had slightly tilted on its side. Right as he noticed this, the radio in his helmet kicked on and told him he needed to go back inside the dive bell immediately, and they were going to try to pull them back up. And so Richard went inside the bell, he closed the hole behind him, and then he and Victor listened to the radio as they told them that the main cable holding the dive bell had slipped out. Now, this main cable was not the only thing connecting the dive bell up to the ship. There was also another clump of wires and tubes that was called the umbilical that ran all their power and hot water and their comms down to the dive bell. But this umbilical was not meant to be load-bearing. But as it stood with this main cable gone, the umbilical was holding the dive bell from slipping to the bottom of the ocean. And so the crew up on the ship decided their only choice was to use the umbilical to reel this dive bell back in. And so they began pulling them up by the umbilical, and almost immediately it completely snapped, and the dive bell fell to the bottom of the ocean about 50 feet below. Now, normally a dive bell would have what's called a clump weight hanging off the bottom of it. And in an emergency, you could detach this clump weight, and the dive bell is buoyant enough it would go up to the surface. But Richard and Victor's company had cut corners and not used a clump weight, and instead attached weights directly to the dive bell, which meant when they hit the ocean floor, the actual dive bell was sitting on the ocean floor, where that hole they would normally escape from was pressed into the seabed, so they could not get out of their dive bell. Whereas if there had been a clump weight, the clump weight would have hit the ground and the dive bell would have hovered slightly over it. And so worst case scenario, they could have gotten out and done a wet transfer into another dive bell. So with the umbilical cut, they had no radio communication, they had no heat, they had no light, and they had very little remaining oxygen. And so all they could do was just sit in darkness and hope somebody rescues them. Less than 30 minutes later, another dive ship arrived and offered to help. Now, they were not expecting to dive that night, so it took about 3 hours before they actually had their rescue divers in the water. And unfortunately, because the location transponder had been removed from the dive bell before Richard and Victor went under, it made it almost impossible for these rescue divers to find it. But after an hour of looking around, they finally found it. It was 7 a.m., and they went right down to the porthole and they shined a light inside of the dive bell, and inside Richard and Victor are given a thumbs up like, hey, we're okay, we're just ready to get rescued. The fact that Richard and Victor were okay was communicated back up to the surface, and everybody on top was so excited, so relieved. And in fact, they called Richard's wife and they told her that, hey, there's been an accident, but your husband's just fine, he'll be out very soon. But despite these rescue divers locating the dive bell, because the ship up above that they were attached to kept moving around, it was proving to be extremely difficult for them to stay over the dive bell. And so for the next 2 hours, these rescue divers desperately tried to thread a new wire through the top of the dive bell, but it was going so poorly, and they kept going around and shining their light into the porthole to check on Richard and Victor. And it was very clear that their situation was getting worse and worse by the second. They were not giving thumbs up and smiling. They looked panicked and desperate, and they'd been without heat now for hours, and it was obvious they were running out of oxygen. Finally, at 9 a.m., so 6 hours after Richard and Victor had first hit the sea floor, the rescue divers managed to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell. And before they signaled to have it brought back up again, they shined a light through the porthole to check on them one more time, and they saw that Richard and Victor were just sitting there with their head in their hands. They were clearly still alive and lucid, but it was like they understood they have very little time left, and if this doesn't work, they're doomed. At this point, the rescue divers called up and said it was ready. They got pulled up to the surface, and then the ship began pulling up the dive bell, and almost immediately the cable snapped. And everybody up on the surface knew that at this point, it was almost impossible for them to survive. But nonetheless, rescue divers went down, and it took a while to find the dive bell because it had moved. But when they did, they shined the light through the porthole, and Richard and Victor were still very much alive, but they were not looking to interact with the divers at the window anymore. They were just sitting there looking down. They were despondent. It was like they were making peace with what they understood was going to happen. They were not going to get out of there. And over the course of the next several hours, as these rescue divers tried desperately to get a new cable through the top of the dive bell, they kept checking on Richard and Victor, and each time they checked, they would slouch lower and lower in their seats until both of them were laying on their side. And then finally, the rescue divers got a cable through the top, and then afterwards, they went back up to the ship, and then the ship was able this time to pull the dive bell up and back on board. But when they opened the door, both Richard and Victor had passed away.